Mr. Chairman, brothers and sisters, might I begin with a small correction, sir? I am a former minister, but I'm not a former member of parliament. I'm still a member of parliament, although the way things are going,
I'm sorry.
I don't know how long the parliament will last.
It's the list, but I'm very sorry for the incorrectness.
I think the issues that have been raised by the last two or three speakers are of not only great importance, but overriding importance. Issues of economic cooperation, of replacing military strategies based on concepts of the quest for dominance, the recognition of all of us as belonging to humankind and not to segments of humankind. But as we have been given this overarching subject of the dialogue of civilizations, I'd like us to just come back for a minute at this fag end of our conference to the main theme, the dialogue of civilizations. And I say this because principally we are here in Rhodes. For it was in the 6th century in Greece, in India, and in China that extraordinarily, simultaneously, ideas came up which a divided humanity was able to recognize as leading towards a unity of humankind. Here it was Socrates. In India it was the Buddha. In China it was Confucius. And if in the 6th century AD their vision of a common humankind was able to begin this dialogue of civilizations, there occurred in the same year of 711 AD two events which were geographically very separated from each other, but which I think
эти события несли в себе наиболее важное значение для современности. 1700
crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and established the great Muslim empire of Andalusia in Iberia, today's Spain and Portugal, an empire that lasted for 680 years, all the way through from 711 to 1491. But although physically, militarily, economically, and even ideologically, such a major civilizational influence was brought to bear on Europe, by the time we come to 1614, all the Moors have been expelled from Iberia, and the last of the Moriscos, who were the Muslims who had been reconverted to Christianity, are also expelled. And Europe conducts an evolution of its civilization in virtual intellectual and spiritual isolation from territories that are only one narrow sea away, the Mediterranean. And during this period, in fact, Rhodes itself becomes the center of a major division in the world between Christendom and the Islamic world through the attempts under the Crusades, which were often based here in Rhodes, to reconquer Jerusalem for Christianity. In that same year of 711, Muhammad bin Qasim was sent by the governor of Baghdad, al-Hajjaj, to conquer India. He arrived in India in the same year. He was as militarily successful as his counterpart here in Iberia, but the total distance he traveled was approximately equal to the distance from Cairo to Alexandria, and he returned within 6 months, leaving an inscription on the first mosque built in India that we must allow the local people to continue their own religion, provided only they pay their taxes to the Caliph in Damascus. And that commencement of a civilizational contact between a Muslim and a non-Muslim people has evolved in the most different direction in India to the manner in which it has grown here in Europe. And I think that is a dialogue which is extremely important to carry forward. For after the first military contact between Islam and India in 711, which ended in 712, for the next 185 years, there was no sword of Islam in the hand of any foreigner, but much of what is today Pakistan had been converted to Islam out of conviction, out of recognizing that this was a religion which brought a message which they called musawwat, or equality, which was in complete contrast to the institutionalized inequality of the Hindu civilization that existed there and continues to exist there. And then there was another period of close to 200 years when there was no military contact. So for 500 years, Islam began by flourishing on the subcontinent without any military or political implications. Then, from 1192 to 1658, continuously for 666 years, that is almost equal to the 680 years that Islam was in Andalusia, we had a Muslim king on the throne of Delhi. And at the end of 666 years of Muslim political and military control of the country, only 24% of the people of India belonged to the Muslim religion. India is the example of coexistence between Islam and other religions, a coexistence facilitated by a lived dialogue of civilizations. Today we are proud in our country to have representatives of every single extant religion in the world. Christianity came to India with St. Thomas in AD 52, long before St. Peter reached Rome. And at a time when the Christians were thrown to the lions if they came out of their catacombs, the Syrian Christian church was established in Kerala as the first established Christian church in the whole world. It's so ancient that a Syrian Christian could perhaps be forgiven for regarding the Pope as a Protestant. The Hindu religion began with the Rig Veda, we don't know when, perhaps 5,000 years ago. And the very first verse of the Rig Veda poses the following question. It describes all of creation, this wonderful thing that has been suddenly created, and asked, who knows how it all began? And comes up with the first answer, only he knows. And then comes up with the next sentence, and perhaps even he does not know. So the skepticism in the mind about finding the ultimate truth has resulted in the peculiar phenomenon that a religion without a church, without a book, without a prophet, and without a revelation begins its process of spiritual inquiry, making it the oldest religion in the world, but comes to its temporary final conclusions only 4,000 years later, making it also the youngest religion in the world. And in the meanwhile, it spawns Buddhism, it spawns Jainism, and then in the philosophical interaction with Islam, it incorporates many of the virtues of Islam, the better thoughts of Islam, the more contemporary thoughts of Islam, into the Hindu mainstream. It's known as the Bhakti movement, and its final apotheosis is to be found in the Sikh religion, where the most holy place of worship of the Sikhs, which is the Golden Temple in Amritsar, it was a Muslim Peer who was invited to lay the foundation stone. And as was pointed out in the discussion on Mr. J.C. Kapoor's legacy at a workshop yesterday, we find that in most of the places of religious worship in India, except at the time of religious festivals, there non-believers who go to these places of worship than people of the faith. So that at Ajmer Sharif or Nagaur Sharif, you will always find more non-Muslims than Muslims. At the Sikh temple in Amritsar, you'll always find more non-Sikhs than you will find Sikhs. And in most of the churches of India, you'll find that the worshippers, except perhaps on big occasions like Christmas, there are more non-Christians sitting in the church than Christians. Now, in consequence of this, we have learnt in India to live with people of every single color in the world. We have learned to live with people of every single religion in the world. We have 28 recognized languages and 3,000 or more dialects. The principal religion, it was pointed out again at the same seminar, have 330 million gods. So it's easy enough to add one or two more. And in this mélange, no one believes that he is any less an Indian than anybody else. And the answer to the question as to who is an Indian really boils down to saying, not in terms of color, not in terms of race, not in terms of language, not in terms of religion, but by giving the answer that an Indian is one who regards anyone else who says he's an Indian as an Indian. And we need to get to that stage in the world as a whole. So we have no wealth to offer you. The Brits took most of it away in the 19th and 20th centuries. We have no military craft to offer you. The last major military work written in India was in the 3rd century BC. We have no political domination to offer you because we don't believe in the quest for dominance. But we do show that we are a laboratory in which all of humanity can live together. And if it is a lived experience in India, then it should be possible in a Europe which can no longer remain isolated behind walls as the castle that you see in the Rhodes city center. It can't remain that way. For already 7 to 8% of the population of Western Europe is Muslim, and it's likely to go up to 16% by the next decade. There are already 16 million Muslims here, and it's going to become about 27 million within the next 10 years. So in these circumstances, where Germany and France already have 15 to 16% of their population as being Muslims, and a majority of them are now Muslims who were born in Europe, grew up in Europe, and grew up with other Europeans, it is an important question as to how to make multiculturalism work. We have Angela Merkel saying multiculturalism is failing. We have Nicolas Sarkozy saying it's not worked out. We have David Cameron saying it's a bit of a flop. And we have the German president saying that Muslims are acceptable, but whether Islam is or not is a separate question. I don't think that is the way forward. The way forward is for all of us to recognize the right of each individual to have his or her own identity, his or her own civilizational identity, to promote ideas of synthesis, of absorption, of assimilation, of syncretism, of actively interacting one with the other, influencing the other, as we have seen in India. In India, our mazars are the only place where Muslims sing. The entire culture of qawwalis is based in Muslim mazars in India. There's nowhere else that this happens, and that's because there was a tradition of bhajans in India. And we at the same time, on the other hand, have accepted other things. So I would very strongly urge, sir, that as this World Public Forum moves into its second decade, we should incorporate in the dialogue of civilizations that takes place here, a dialogue between composite civilizations like those of India and non-composite civilizations like those particularly of Western Europe, to see whether a lived experience of being together is feasible or not for the future. At the same time, there is the subset that, having said all this, I have to acknowledge that there has been a division between India and Pakistan, that the amount of bloodshed at the time of partition was perhaps unprecedented in world history, and that hostility still continues. And that therefore, what may be an Indian tradition must be expanded to the whole of South Asia. And to do this, it is necessary for the Indians not to be arrogant about what they have inherited from the past, but to show that in the present, they can demonstrate that compassion and that humanity to which they have an obligation to rise. So perhaps we need a dialogue between India and Pakistan as part and parcel, as a subset of this dialogue among civilizations. And yesterday, finally, I spent some time at the round table on Eurasia. And listening to that dialogue, it is quite clear that there is a space called Eurasia, which is at the moment occupied by about as many powers as initially began the European Common Market, which over time has expanded from 6 to 27. And therefore, there's every possibility of the Eurasian space, which today commences in Belarus and continues up to Kazakhstan, to include all those countries which are at present not part of the formal Eurasian space, although they are part of that Eurasian space geographically, historically, and civilizationally. But I feel that it is not enough to conceive Eurasia purely in terms of the space so defined today. If you like to call that Eurasia, that's fine by me. But can we then talk of Europe and Asia? For after all, Europe is only the western peninsula of the same landmass of which South Asia is the southern peninsula. And the size of the southern peninsula is almost exactly equal north to south. Here, of course, it's east to west, as from Moscow to Lisbon and from the North Cape to Rhodes. The geographic area of Europe is about the same as that of India, and the population of our population is about 1.5 times what it is here at 1.2 billion. And when one considers that China and all the countries around it have also been always part of an Eastern civilization, what I think we need to be working towards as the first step towards uniting all of humanity is to think in terms of Europe and Asia, retrieving in the 21st century the position they held until 1492. For it was on this landmass that almost everything that goes by the name of civilization had its beginnings. And we have been divided by history ever since 1492. And we are willing to drag these behind us into this great exercise. But that is the manner in which we must look at humankind and the evolution of a common humanity. For it cannot be on the basis of a quest for dominance. It cannot be on the assumption that certain values are superior Western values which have to be adhered to by the rest of the world. It cannot be on the basis of military domination, and it cannot be on the basis of economic exploitation. Either we all belong to one family, the human family, or we don't, by which I mean humanity ceases to exist. That is the hard choice before us. We need not only a dialogue of civilizations, but a lived dialogue of civilizations. And there are countries around the world, including the experience of Russia and Greater Russia, that are totally relevant to this exercise. Yesterday, again, I heard about the Garden of the Five Intellects that is coming up at St. Petersburg, and that is the kind of synthesis of thought, the deliberate promotion of a dialogue between different traditions that constitutes a constructive response to a world that is otherwise hurtling to destruction. So the choice before us is sharp and final. 711 India or 711 Europe. 711 Europe will take us to total destruction. 711 India might still indicate the way for all of us to go forward, not separately, but together, retaining our respective identities, but having a sense of belonging to a larger whole, to a larger humanity. And in that manner, the World Public Forum can, I think, make a very, very important contribution to giving all of humanity a sense of belonging. The owners of the world, Mr. Dolmayer, not being one country or one set of countries, the owners of the world being all of us, for all of us have a common stake in our respective survivals and in our common survival. And into that framework, if we were to inject the kind of ideas that we have heard from Madame Larouche, then I think we can move forward. We cannot handle strategic questions, economic questions, social questions, and racial questions on their own or separately one from the other. They have to be integrated in a holistic manner into seeing how world civilization can go forward and all of us can benefit from being human beings. Thank you very much.